Forgotten Heroes story, it turns out, which should have been the name of this panel. We didn't make the name of the panel, I might add. Thrown together. So at about sundown on March 20th, 1863, I don't need the mic, as you might have guessed, I'm an NCO. Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter's confidence finally ran out. Porter, right there. For days he had ignored the naysayers who worried that his iron-plated, smoke-belching flotilla, containing the prize of the Mississippi Fleet, his 5 City-class gunboats, would not be able to complete the meandering labyrinthine journey to the high ground northeast of rebel-held Vicksburg. One look at the exceedingly narrow, vine-choked channel of Deer Creek a few days prior had prompted his friend William Tecumseh Sherman to pronounce that any further advance of the expedition was too perilous to even contemplate. Porter emphatically disagreed. He insisted on advancing his boats, damming the debris, snags, and cramped confines at least quarter speed ahead. The landsmen of Sherman's command, still hacking their way through the swamps some distance to the south in a vain attempt to keep up, would not be able to secure his flanks until the foremost regiments of the one division Sherman brought along could arrive. Until then, the Navy was on its own. In part to distract rebel attention from a log-jammed effort to turn the rebel defenses elsewhere among the tortuous bayous north of Vicksburg at Yazoo Pass, Major General Ulysses S. Grant and Porter had together plotted the expedition a week prior. The flotilla would ascend the Yazoo River, make a left-hand turn into Steele's Bayou before coming into view of the rebel batteries atop Haynes's Bluffs and Snyder's Bluffs, with one division of Sherman's 15th Corps following behind aboard steamers and towed coal barges. Porter's boats would plow the brown waters of Steele's Bayou before turning into the gauntlet of Black Bayou to gain the only slightly wider channel of Deer Creek. And from here, Sherman's force would have to advance on foot, given that the channel was too narrow and dangerous for the portage of the wide riverboats. Ideally, after ascending to Rolling Fork and then plowing east to Sunflower River, Porter would be able to re-enter the Yazoo north of the rebel-held bluffs, having effectively flanked all enemy defenses. Provided that the route could be both secured and maintained, additional troops could be dispatched through the winding bayous to a newly secured landing. At the very least, rebels would have to be drawn away from the logjam at Yazoo Pass, if not from Vicksburg itself, to confront this new threat, thus growing the menu of options for Grant. At least that's what it all looked like on paper. Only a short distance up Deer Creek, Porter's lead gunboats began to encounter enormous trees, deliberately felled across the creek to bar his way. Ordering his tars to debouch from their iron behemoths and clear the obstructions by hand, the salty admiral was not about to be deterred by a few local secessionist troublemakers. But the number of obstructions seemed to increase exponentially as the flotilla crawled further northward. And worse yet, some of the boats to the rear likewise reported spotting contingents of rebel horsemen driving gangs of slaves as they felled ever more trees across the channel in an attempt to block both Porter's advance and his potential escape. Fending off these enemy work parties quickly proved a vexing challenge, as most of the guns aboard the boats could not gain a line of sight over the steep levee embankment and thus could not protect themselves. When his flotilla began receiving first small arms and then light artillery fire, the full predicament that the admiral was in became obvious. The rebels were in the process of springing a trap, and Porter and his embattled gunboats were the game. Now, after more than 3.5 incredibly frustrating months of almost nothing but failure in Grant's long campaign to seize the Gibraltar of the Mississippi and reopen the main artery of the country to oil commerce, Porter well knew that the Army, Navy, and indeed nation could not possibly absorb the loss of their famed Western flotilla. Several of the craft in his command were nearly household names across the North, many still bearing scars of duels with rebel batteries from Henry and Donelson. The blow to national morale that reports the wholesale destruction or even capture of Porter's fleet was terrible to contemplate, and the blow of the same to Grant's campaign, potentially scuttling the entire venture altogether, along with maybe even that of Port Hudson further south due to lack of Navy support, was even worse. Now, straining his eyes to peer through the smoke to the south, Porter's anxiety increased by the minute as daylight faded and it finally became clear that Sherman was not coming with any miracle in the form of blue-coated infantry. Reluctantly ordering his tars to coat their slippery inclined holes with slime from the creek bottom to prevent nighttime rebel boarding, he added in a foreboding tone that his captains probably ought to prepare to spike their guns, scuttle all of the craft, and escape on foot through the swamps. He could hardly believe the words that were flowing from his own mouth and pen. Now, in a last-ditch effort to reach Sherman and apprise his friend and comrade of the desperate situation he and his tars found themselves in, Porter turned to his last best hope. None of his officers or men could have possibly known the fastest way through the meandering bayou tributaries and flooded forests of Cyprus back to Sherman's last known position. Though he previously sent staffers south by water, the same way the flotilla had gone north, that route was now blocked. He had only one option left. Now, always nearby during the campaign, assisting Porter in piloting the boats through the swamps and preparing him for whatever geography he knew lay ahead along the way, was a recently freed local slave, or ex-slave rather, whose name is sadly lost to history, but who proudly apparently went by the nickname Telegraph. If there was any possible way to get a message back to Sherman, he was likely the only one who could find it. So scribbling a note on tissue paper describing the impending disaster and pressing need for Sherman to hasten a relief column by whatever means necessary north to the rescue, Porter wrapped the desperate entreaty in a tobacco leaf and handed it to Telegraph. And with that, he was off. Now, precisely how Telegraph made his way through the more than 20 miles of inky darkness in the middle of the night, in the middle of the southern Deer Creek Valley that night, we may never know. But he did. And shortly before dawn, an anxious Sherman, still awaiting the arrival of most of his command while worrying about the sounds of distant thunder to the north, was greeted at his headquarters by a winded black man bearing a tobacco leaf containing Porter's message. Now, immediately impressed with the urgency of the moment, Kump, as he went, scribbled a reply promising to hasten forward whatever contingent he could throw together from what forces were already on hand. So this he handed back to Telegraph and promised $50 in cash, which is a lot of money in 1863, should he successfully deliver it back to Porter and then return to Kump at Hill's plantation, or Reality. So Telegraph agreed to these terms, but sadly the intrepid soul was never to collect on the agreement. Attempting to slip back through rebel lines to reach Porter in the early hours just before dawn, he was spotted and captured by secessionist pickets. While whatever subsequently happened to him is forever lost to the record, Telegraph had fulfilled the most crucial part of his personal mission, and indeed that of the entire expedition. Sherman now knew, for the first time, of the seriousness of Porter's situation, and promptly dispatched the only 3 regiments he had on hand northward toward the sound of the guns. Now, falling in behind Colonel Giles Alexander Smith, the combined 800 men of the terribly understrength 6th and 8th Missouri, along with 116th Illinois, rushed northward that morning. Yet another recently freed local black man led them from the front of the column, showing them the way. And sadly, his name is also lost to history, but this, quote, Negro guide was certain he knew the fastest road through the swamps. But a short distance into their meandering 20-mile journey, the infantrymen began to notice trees felled across the channel. Slaves from the many magnificent palatial plantations skirting the banks of Deer Creek approached the column, warning Smith of rebel cavalry nearby, who were forcing parties of slaves to obstruct Porter's route. All of them freely shared that they, quote, had been notified to be ready at nightfall to continue the work. And Smith was not about to let that happen, and accordingly, quote, ordered all able-bodied Negroes to be taken along. Warning the few white overseers he encountered that, quote, they would be held responsible for any more obstructions being placed across the creek. Falling in quickly behind the onrushing blue column, the men crossed the threshold from slavery into freedom, or at least toward freedom. For the moment, however, Smith was not caught up in acting the part of emancipator. He was on a mission, and these, quote, able-bodied Negroes represented the most vital tool in the rebel arsenal that was just then on the verge of wrecking the entire Vicksburg campaign. By early afternoon, the 3 regiments could distinctly hear Porter's guns feebly lashing out at their attackers, and by dusk, his foremost Missourian skirmish teams were in deadly touch with their rebel counterparts. Making contact with a relieved, but still greatly concerned Porter, Smith took up a defensive position along the bank and dispersed his different companies to provide what security they could for the boats and begin pulling and cutting the obstructions from the channel to allow for Porter to withdraw, as he's not interested in going forward anymore. In this, the gathering host of freedmen that joined the column proved themselves once again invaluable as force multipliers. In fact, upon closer inspection, it became clear to many that even those slaves with the rebels had assisted the effort in their own way, deliberately felling trees across the channel in a manner that would make the removal as straightforward as possible. The slaves in the Deer Creek Valley knew precisely what stakes were at hand, and despite the orders of their rebel masters, toiled collectively to pioneer their own freedom. Now, anxiously awaiting out the impenetrable darkness that followed dusk, Smith began to grow wary of his overly extended position. He had no idea how many rebels were in the area. Porter's egress was taking an inordinately long time, and there was no knowing when or even if Sherman was ever coming with the rest of the division as reinforcements. And when the sun arose the next day, the painstaking withdrawal continued, his worst fears were realized. Sounds of gunfire were followed by sightings of rebel infantry and once again artillery advancing toward the creek from both his front and rear. And now not only were Porter's gunboats threatened, but so were the embattled skirmishers of Smith's command and their impromptu black compatriots. Once again, disaster loomed on the Mississippi horizon. Meanwhile, nearly 30 miles away as the crow flies, and at least double that as the alligator swims, if you allow that, the rest of the three brigades comprising the remainder of the division had been confronting an altogether different set of challenges. Slogging their way northward by a combination of steamer transport, coal barge, and mud-encrusted boot, the command was forced to tear apart slave cabins, to build bridges, and deforest whole properties, to corduroy swamps, all contingent chiefly upon the efforts of the 15th Corps' brand new Pioneer Corps detachments. Though containing all those white volunteers each brigadier could find in his ranks who displayed mechanical skill and fitness to an extent that he might superintend mechanical and engineer work, whatever that means, the lifeblood of these detachments were the same, quote, able-bodied Negroes who were just then assisting Smith in retrieving Porter's beleaguered flotilla. The division employed more than 150 of these men, which is nearly the size of a few of its regiments, at a rate of about $10 a month, mostly in pulling and hauling, the maximally toilsome and often time-consuming, that's key, portions of pioneer work. Working side by side with Sherman's white regiments, nearly all of which had been nearly decimated by disease over the past several months, the black men provided the bulk of the hard physical labor necessary to speedily advance the command through the all but impenetrable terrain. That's actually where they were. Fortunately for Sherman, Smith, and Porter, these freedmen were no strangers to hard work. Sweating alongside the white troops of the division, men of all ranks and colors, frequently half submerged in frigid bayou water right as it's March, managed to shove the command through the swamps to Sherman's position 20 miles south of Porter by the evening of the same day that Smith departed northward. Personally leading the division off its transports through the darkness of night with only candlelight to guide them, Sherman hurried the brigades into position to head northward at first light. 20 miles north, once again hemmed in, Porter watched and listened as reports arrived to his buttoned-up tars that Smith's hard-pressed and outnumbered relief force was itself being surrounded. Once again, pangs of anxiety rushed through his body as he contemplated the worst-case scenario. Just at that moment, though, the sounds of heavy rifle fire crested to the south. Smoke rose above the cypresses, and Smith fretted that his southernmost skirmish detachments were certainly captured or destroyed. Rushing a company to one of Porter's ironclads, the Missourians clambered aboard and the crew plowed the metal-plated giant through a few remaining obstructions in a mad dash to save their comrades. And only when the smoke had dissipated did the reality finally show its lovely face. The shots had not been fired by charging rebels, but by the skirmishers of Brigadier General David Stewart's division, just arrived with an exhausted Sherman in the lead after having literally run more than 20 miles in 5 hours' time. As the now outnumbered rebels fled the scene, Porter's boats were finally safe, and with them Grant's campaign for Vicksburg, and perhaps even the Union. Now, as the exploits of the expedition made their way to the northern press, the operational narrative of what was eventually referred to as the Steele's Bayou expedition gradually took shape and a consensus formed. While falling well short of the expedition's original objectives, through the careful coordination of all units involved, hard work, inspiring leadership, and brutally hard marching, Stewart's division had single-handedly saved Porter's flotilla. The entire expedition had been, quote, used in labor, constant and severe. Embedded reporters admired how the, quote, officers and men worked with equal alacrity, whether in building bridges or making forced marches, both by day and in the night. Sherman's own observation that the timing of his relief column's arrival had been, quote, very opportune, was a profound understatement. Had the division hit any snag in its forward momentum, had any relatively minute part of the command failed in its assigned duties, the relief column reaching Porter's flotilla even an hour later, it is quite possible that the boats would have already been captured or scuttled, and with them the campaign. Little to no mention of the signal contributions made by the more than 500 freed people involved in one capacity or another in the operation ever made its way to print. Although one embedded reporter did observe how slaves in, quote, every instance everywhere were our friends, doing everything and anything in their power to assist us, he still gave all credit for operational success to the Army. While both Porter and Sherman did acknowledge in great brevity the efforts of Telegraph, though not by name, both refrained from attaching too much attention to the freedmen's valorous acts. Nor did the invaluable efforts of hundreds of additional black men and women to assist Sherman's division in waging punitive warfare on the southern Deer Creek Valley during Porter's slow withdrawal make much of an impact on white observers. Helping foraging parties find where their masters hid rebel cotton, foodstuffs, weapons, and other items, thousands of now free black men and women from the area topped off their assistance to the government by absconding with their master's most militarily valuable property of all, themselves. In doing so, they simultaneously took the first perilous step toward freedom, entered into a mutually advantageous alliance with the U.S. military, and landed a critical blow against the secessionist rebellion's key center of gravity. Now, 2 weeks later, the Corps' other division, under Frederick Steele, embarked on its own expedition to the erstwhile untouched northern extremity of the same Deer Creek Valley. Charged by Sherman with sweeping his division southward, clearing the country so that the people understand that we claim the unmolested navigation of the Mississippi and will have it if all the country within reach has to be laid waste, the erstwhile somewhat conservative Steele carried out his orders to the letter. Once again, freed people proved indispensable assets to the operational success of the mission, rebuilding burnt bridges, serving as guides, sources of human intelligence, assisting foragers in discovering foodstuffs and valuables hidden by their masters. And once again, tremendous numbers joined the column, many mounted on the same mules they had been using to plow the fields of their masters for spring planting. In close cooperation with these freed people, Steele's division managed to seize more than 1,000 head of livestock and many other items, wagons, carts, buggies, and burned nearly 500,000 bushels of corn, which accounted for about 90% of the county's corn harvest in 1860. And according to the freed people talked to, much of it was, quote, intended for the rebel garrison at Vicksburg. So therefore, whenever the army finally did make its way to Vicksburg, any siege would likely be much shorter. Now, due to the chronic lack of success of the 15th Corps when engaged in offensive combat operations at places like Chickasaw Bayou and Arkansas Post, those in the ranks of its two divisions had gradually evolved a cultural aversion to the assault of entrenched rebels. Indeed, Sherman himself was forced to admit that he had, quote, no troops which can be made to assault. Now, by contrast, the success they experienced in these two raiding expeditions gave rise to a new confidence in an altogether different way of war. They were taking the war to the Secesh and winning without firing a shot. And, quote, I think with the policy now being carried out that we are crushing the rebellion, one pleased Hawkeye officer pronounced in the wake of his fiery foray through Deer Creek Valley, and will continue to crush it, though we be repulsed from every stronghold for months to come. Throughout the forthcoming campaign for Vicksburg, the Corps' most salient contributions to the successes of Grant's army were to be made mostly off the battlefield, raiding rebel breadbaskets, positioning its divisions in potentially threatening locations, destroying rebel infrastructure, and freeing rebel slaves. And while they would again find themselves under fire during Grant's two bloody assaults after investing the city, both of which only reified their evolved aversion to such tactics, and again during the months of the fabled siege, it was as Grant's premier raiding force that they made their most salient contributions to the achievement of the Army's objectives. Now, Freedmen provided a panoply of key skills that enabled the Corps to conduct these raiding operations with maximal and often vital, as we've seen, efficiency and speed. The very built southern environment through which the Army moved had been all but completely hand-fashioned by slaves. Gangs of slaves had built or participated materially in building the roads, the bridges, the levees that the Army trod upon and over. They built and stocked the corn cribs, the barns, and smokehouses that hid the valuable provender over which the competing forces vied. They even built the homes and cabins in which their masters and they themselves dwelled. And in part because of their familiarity with such work, they were likewise the ideal candidates to assist in both deconstructing it or, when necessary, replacing what portions of it had been destroyed by the rebel enemy. As they had done at Steele's Bayou and Deer Creek, ex-slaves would remain key to the operational success of the Corps' way of war. More than that, Freedmen continued to grease the wheels of nearly every facet of the Corps' operations throughout the campaign, including during the investiture and eventual siege of Vicksburg, serving as guides, informants, and omnipresent laborers, corduroying swamps, building and improving vital logistical routes, driving wagons and mule teams, and even toiling under fire in the trenches and saps, inching ever closer to rebel redouts and eventual victory. Though they were never permitted to bear arms within the ranks of the Corps, and no USCT regiment was ever assigned to the 15th Corps headquarters, given the command's operational predilections, culture, and way of war, the freedmen of its pioneer corps represented a far more operationally valuable component of its personnel than might otherwise have been the case. While logistical support and the maintenance of maximum mobility is of crucial importance for any military organization, representing the primary arbiters of these capacities in an Army Corps that ever increasingly made its most significant contributions more by moving than by fighting, makes the labor of these men even more operationally significant. So over the next 2 years of hard fighting and even harder campaigning across Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, and the Carolinas, the same contingent of freedmen, the exact same individuals who joined the Corps' pioneer detachments in the spring of 1863, would continue to serve with the command, enabling its characteristic raiding operations throughout every successive campaign from Lookout Mountain to the March to the Sea. Before the surrender of the primary rebel army in the Western Theater, Bennett's Place, the 15th Corps had traveled more than 4,000 miles, that's the Appalachian Trail twice over, on foot. Many of those miles cleared, corduroyed, or guided by ex-slaves pioneering either their own freedom or that of their families and kinsfolk still in bondage. And finally, while historians have proven ever increasingly interested in the experiences of slaves and freed people during and in the immediate wake of the American Civil War, as well as their role in proactively self-emancipating and transforming the character of the war in the process, freed people remain conspicuously absent from the prevailing operational history of the contest beyond the exploits of the United States Colored Troops, or USCT. But the salient contributions of both black civilians out of uniform and even white soldiers charged with guarding logistical routes and serving in less glamorous capacities within the federal war machine must, by necessity, feature prominently in any holistic, comprehensive, and accurate assessment of the operational history of the War of the Rebellion. And before we evaluate the combat performance of regiments and batteries arrayed on the battlefield, or even those rummaging through corn cribs, chicken coops, and slave cabins across the South in a bid to snuff out the so-called Confederacy's capacity for self-sustainment, we must begin with asking how those blue-coated men arrived at their respective points of contact with the enemy to begin with. And in doing so, the historian must inevitably acknowledge the invaluable operational contributions of the freedmen, the same individual who had unquestionably the most to gain or lose. Thank you.